So I'll go ahead and start. Hi, I'm Jim Newman. I'm a principal at Linnaean Solutions, but really probably the important part for today is that I'm co-facilitator with Diane Tufts of the Living Future Collaborative here in this area. We call ourselves the New England Living Future Collaborative, though that's we sort of try and do our best to have a pretty expansive approach. The collaborative has been working this year especially to really get involved in the issue of carbon. And so today we have a really fantastic opportunity to look at what the city of Somerville is doing and start to understand how that potentially can roll out to other places and really the effect that it might be having. So we have with us Oliver Seller-Garcia, who's the director of the Office of Sustainability for the City of Somerville, who oversees a lot of the pathways and work. And I'll let Oliver describe how that works for Somerville. We also have Aaron Gunderson, who is a director of Passive House Massachusetts, to talk about Passive House, which is one of the pathways that is available within the Somerville zoning overlay sort of regulatory pathways. And we also have Jacob Bloom from Cambridge 7, who is a zero carbon certification ambassador for the International Living Future Institute. And Jacob will talk about the zero carbon certification, which is also a pathway to available within the Somerville Overlay District zoning pathways. So before we jump into that, I'm going to hand this to Meredith Elbaum, the executive director of the Built Environment Plus, the organization with which we are a partner in general and in this particular event. Thanks, Meredith.
Fantastic. Thanks, Jim. Glad to have everyone here today. I'm going to give a special shout out both to Jim and Neil as past board members of Built Environment Plus, and we've got Galen Nelson here, who is a current board member of Built Environment Plus. Super excited to have particularly Aaron here and Passive House Mass as our partners in this event and putting this on. Built Environment Plus, we're a nonprofit focused on driving the sustainability of the built environment, do a lot of things, education. This is an example of that. Community building, getting people to know each other. It's really good to see some of you. And speaking of, if you can turn your cameras on, it'd be great to see your faces so that we take this from so that we can see reactions and see how we're doing in terms of the presentation. If you can't do that, that's fine. But if you're willing and able, we love to see your faces. Thanks, Galen. So leading by example. And we also do a little bit of advocacy, really trying to tell people when to look up and get people together, and then put out some resources and tools. So we have a resource on the status of zero energy buildings in Massachusetts right now. Speaking of community building, just to point out a few things that we have going on. Tomorrow we have a health and wellness roundtable in the morning at from 9 to 10 o'clock, talking about resources for materials. Next week, we have a Women in Green Roundtable, somewhat related topic in that we're focusing on women energy modelers. And then the day after, we have also related a carbon and energy roundtable where we're going to be talking about approaches to the net zero code that DOER is going to be putting out for review shortly. And we're trying to get the community together on that. And the last thing I'll point out is that in September, we've got an open house on all of our education initiatives and ways to get you free money for the education initiatives. So I'm super excited about this event. I actually, in full disclosure, live in Somerville and am excited about hearing about this. So I'm going to turn it back over to you, Jim.
Fantastic. Thanks, Meredith. And just a reminder that really the activities happening through Build Environment Plus and through the collaborative are in depth and super interesting. We've done a bunch of really fantastic work, education work over the last 2 years, 3 years. So let's jump in. I'm going to ask Oliver to go ahead and share his presentation, give a little quick introduction of yourself, and we'll make our way into this process. And I will be watching chat for anything coming up.
Okay, great. Thank you, Jim. And as Jim mentioned, I'm Oliver Seller-Garcia. I'm the director of the Office of Sustainability and Environment in Somerville. And when Jim and Diane approached me about this topic, I thought it would be a great opportunity for Somerville to tell you a little bit about what's going on if you don't already know it. But also we are really curious what you think. This is an opportunity for us to learn what's going on as well. So I really hope my presentation, which I'll put up in a minute, is to lay some of the groundwork, maybe kind of baseline everyone for the next presentations and for some really good Q&A. So really quickly, this is what I'm going to talk about today. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about our carbon goals and the strategies that we were working on, how zoning fits into this as a tool, and then to tell you more about our sustainability in zoning, specifically the low carbon building components of that. So let's just start from the beginning, which is, why is low zero carbon new construction important to us? Well, from our greenhouse gas accounting that we do every 2 years, this is 2016, but it doesn't shift very much. Buildings and stationary energy are 2/3 of our emissions in Somerville. Our climate action plan, Somerville Climate Forward, which we completed at the end of 2018, is a really broad-reaching plan. It covers greenhouse gas reductions, resilience, and equity. But reflecting what an important part of our carbon footprint buildings are, we have four of our 13 strategies are really directly related to reducing that stationary energy part of the pie. And these are the 13 action areas in our climate plan, and the ones with stars are the ones specifically focused on buildings. So I'm going to talk about 2 of those, and I'm going to do it in reverse order. So these relate specifically to new construction. So as you'll see, if you look at our plan, we really look at new construction and existing buildings quite differently, as makes sense. And for a lot of this, we really think that the best strategy is also to think about what is going on at the state level versus what we can do internal to our community. And so we really prioritize working for state level changes so that new construction across the state will be net zero. So the actions there were for us to play more of an advocacy role, and we've partnered and collaborated with many of the people on this call. So this probably won't be news to you, but we were active participants in voting on the new International Energy Conservation Code, and also strong vocal advocates for the net zero stretch code that was authorized in the recent legislation and that Meredith alluded to earlier. So then on a more sort of internal to our community level, we had a goal to explore the feasibility of a net zero code or something like a standard for our buildings, understanding that the building code is set at the state level and our hands are really tied. And so that work has really kind of taken a winding path and more quickly found traction in looking at what we can do within our zoning authority to do something like a standard. But that brings me to another of the points that I outlined, which is zoning is a very imperfect tool for climate. And so this is a slide of a presentation that I made with George Proakis, our planning director, back in 2015. We've been thinking about this for a long time. And he really wanted to explain to people, there's a lot that we want to do with sustainability and a lot that we can do with zoning, and where they overlap is not very much. And so I don't have to explain this to you, but I'm going to anyway, which is just to remind everyone that, zoning is not a great tool to, change our, everything about new construction. We really can't restrict materials or set any sort of energy standards. These are all the things that we're all familiar with. Those of us who've been advocating for action at the state level, we're kind of left with like the Swiss cheese of all of the big things that might really matter. And so boiling it down to just a big oversimplification, what this means is that we're really left in zoning using effectively incentives to get the high level of building performance that we're looking for. And so what I'm gonna explain now, what we're really looking at are some requirements that are, I'll go back, some requirements that really have not been questioned very much from a legal precedent standpoint in terms of standards, but also the majority of what we're able to do is with incentives, because we are not actually requiring anything that takes the place or supersedes the building and energy codes. We're just offering bonuses instead of that. And I don't think that this is the best way to get high performing new buildings built, but I think it's what we have to deal with in the current regulatory environment. And I will just say that when we talk to a lot of other communities in Massachusetts that don't have the same hot real estate market that we do, it's kind of hard to make the pitch that what we're doing is a particularly replicable model, because this works here because everyone wants to build in Somerville right now. Okay, so let me just talk a little bit about what our zoning includes. So for buildings over 25,000 square feet, every building must be LEED Gold certifiable. If it's over 50,000 square feet, LEED Platinum. We also, I'll just go back and say this applies to a new citywide zoning that went into effect at the end of 2019. So this was a huge effort that our planning department put together. I am not in the planning department, but we had a lot of internal consultants in different departments around the city that supported the creation of this zoning overhaul, and that we also advise in the administration of it. Okay, so this is a big new change, which is the creation of a net zero building definition. And so what that basically boils down to is a couple of different pathways that, in addition, have no fossil fuel combustion for HVAC or cooking. And those two pathways are passive house or zero carbon. That is for all buildings except for labs. Labs can be net zero buildings if they achieve LEED Platinum. This was a carve out that we developed in response to a lot of helpful and critical feedback from the industry about the different needs of lab buildings and the current state of technology to be able to achieve the other pathway performance requirements. And if you can remember the world before the pandemic, we had a great summit at the end of February 2020 about LEED for labs, where we discussed all of this, and then none of us saw each other for another year, and we've all moved on. Okay, so then how are these definitions applied? So citywide, there is a residential unit density bonus for net zero buildings. So in any residential district, you can build multifamily buildings with more units in them if they are net zero. Then there is a overlay district called the master plan overlay district. And that essentially trades unlimited height for net zero buildings. This slide is hard to read. I put it in here for posterity because everyone asks, can we have a copy of the slides? And I figured that this is something good for you to look at when you have the copy of the slides on your desktop. This is a flow chart to understand basically, you know, where your building would fall in terms of having to meet some of these requirements or take advantage of some of the bonuses. So to comply, this is just, you know, there's lots of different things that you have to do to comply, but related to the zoning that I mentioned, typically what this looks like is, you know, submitting a lead checklist and a narrative. We also have a questionnaire that we ask energy and resiliency questions about, which is both to collect information, but really to prompt thinking. And then also recently we're piloting the use of a low load building calculator that, you know, gives everyone the energy information that we're actually looking for, which is to understand how is your proposed building actually performing compared to a code building or a much more high performing building. So I'm just going to close here by saying that by reflecting a little bit on what we saw in the, you know, where this came from and where we're going now. So the intention of having multiple pathways, which is really the discussion for today, is, you know, giving lots of different choices, but there are some nuances. So with Passive House, we saw, you know, just an ever greater uptick in use and awareness of Passive House, and really good precedents in the residential sector, particularly affordable housing. For zero carbon, we were really interested in seeing embodied carbon as part of the standard. And also we wanted to use our, you know, our position to try to introduce a new standard into the region for its use. These numbers are already a little outdated, but we, you know, in the year and a half that this zoning has been in effect, we've seen, you know, I'd say close to 200 Passive House units be, you know, go into the permitting pipeline. Over 20% of that is affordable housing, and that's not just because of the affordable housing minimum that is required, but also because we're seeing all affordable Passive House buildings being proposed. We've seen a number of LEED Platinum labs and some Passive House residential office buildings. We've also seen buildings that are not in the relevant districts, you know, striving to meet some of these standards, even if they don't have to, which is remarkable. And here's the downer that I'll close with. We haven't seen any zero carbon proposals. So my main question for the conversation today is, you know, why do we think that is? So I will close there. I will just say I do have an extra slide that I kept in case there was a question, but now I'm realizing it might be helpful for you to see what the sort of, you all know Somerville, so moving around Somerville, this will give you an idea of what is available for net zero development, and that's, you know, an enormous portion of the city. So the black hashed area is where you could basically build unlimited height net zero buildings, and that really tracks well with our development areas and new transit. And residential is a large swath of the city. So I see that some questions have popped up. I'm gonna defer to Jim if you think there's any urgent ones to answer now, or if we can do it later and I can pass off to Aaron. You let me know.
Let's answer these two about certifiable
Okay.
real quick, because I think that's easy and you probably have it. So both for the LEED, it's LEED certifiable as opposed to certified. But is that the same for the zero carbon and passive house, or are you expected to go through the certification in order to, you know, get the density bonus, which is sort of backwards because you get it first, but whatever.
Right. For LEED, it is certifiable. And I believe for passive house, which is what I'm more, well, we haven't seen any for zero carbon, but I think you can't really move forward without actually registering your project and essentially going for the certification. So I think it kind of de facto becomes you do become certified.
Right. Yeah, that sort of makes sense. And I can say that's been our experience working on projects in Somerville. And then I guess Galen had a quick question about, is the density bonus applicable only to new construction, or does it include more like
Yeah,
large
so
scale renovation?
This is all new construction, and one of the, you know, since this is all about new construction, I didn't think to mention it, but one of the reasons why zoning is such a imperfect tool is that it really only touches new construction or major renovation. And one of the interesting stats that our planning department pulled together several years ago for that presentation that I showed you a slide of is that at a historical rate of building turnover, we would need 300 years for all our buildings to hit this current iteration of zoning. So, you know, zoning is not what's going to transform that big 66% of our carbon footprint, but it is a important portion of it, and one that we have more control over now.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, we will want that in 300 years. It's going to be important, but we're probably not going to, you know, be there to experience it. That's fantastic. Thanks. Allison has a question about the calculator.
Okay, so
yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I'll just say the calculator.
We're doing fine.
My staff or I email you the calculator when you submit a proposal. But I have no problem with people getting in touch with me or the planning department. We can talk about whether it's something you'd be interested in taking a look at and playing around with. I'd say if you're going to be working on projects, we certainly don't want this to be a surprise. So, but given that we're just sort of piling it right now, it won't be, we hope it won't be too burdensome.
Sounds great. Awesome. Thanks a ton, Oliver. That was quite informative. And we'll come back with a lot more opportunity to ask questions and to bring up comments as we make our way through this. We're gonna have a lot of time, which is great. We're very excited about it. And thanks for the questions so far. Aaron, I'm gonna pass this off to you to talk about that passive house pathway that Oliver just outlined.
Great. Thanks, Jim. So yeah, I'm here to talk about Passive House, and Oliver, thanks for that presentation. It's great to see what Somerville is doing and to see that those updated numbers on the number of units that are registered here as passive houses because of it. I think you're doing a really good job of setting an example that I hope other municipalities are going to be following. So I'm going to get my slides up here and show. In the meantime, I'm just going to kind of introduce myself. I'm Aaron Gunderson. I'm with Passive House Massachusetts. We're a nonprofit organization here in the state, and we kind of work, within Massachusetts and kind of throughout the New England region to promote the passive house building standard. We do trainings, educational events, and advocacy around it. Also a certified passive house trade person and a green building consultant. Fantastic. So yeah, here to talk about passive house, how it fits into the low carbon building pathway. Really, I'm kind of go through a little brief of what passive house is. I ask questions as I do this. I don't quite know how, you folks really know a lot about passive house already. Some of you may, some of you may not. So ask me some questions during this if you're more curious. I can do a deeper dive on certain topics. But I also want to start out by kind of showing this collage of different passive house projects, really to set aside the myth that passive house is about small houses. Passive house, despite the name, is a standard that applies to all building types. Mostly what we see happening here in the States are residential buildings, so either single family all the way up to large multifamily buildings. buildings tend to be the most common passive house buildings. So here's a whole bunch of them in Massachusetts. And you see a few different types, actually. The one up there in the top left corner is actually a school that was just completed up in Beverly. So it's a one building school, part of a school in Beverly. The one next to it is a university, a residence hall down at Wheaton College. Then you have Finch Cambridge there, a large 98 unit affordable housing building in Cambridge. You have a single family net zero passive house in Cambridge as well next to that. And then at the bottom is passive house office in Newton. That's net zero with those solar panels that you see on it. So different building types, different examples of what you can achieve with passive house. You can also go really tall. So on the right here is Cornell Tech has a campus building on Roosevelt Island in New York City, and that's a certified passive house. For a while, was the tallest passive house building in the world. On the left is just the conceptual image of Winthrop Square in downtown Boston. That's being built right now. When it's finished, it's going to have the largest square footage of passive house office space in the world. So they're certifying the office component of that to passive house. Just giving you an example of the different types of buildings that can achieve passive house certification. And in addition to new buildings, we also see existing buildings being renovated to become passive house. So this is the image of row houses in Brooklyn. And one of those was renovated to be a passive house. Still hard to tell right now, but throw up the thermal image and it makes it a little easier to see. That one in the center that's blue, that's a renovated passive house. Basically, it's throwing a blanket over it, trapping all the heat in. The buildings next to it with the red, yellow, green coloring there on the thermal image, that's heat escaping. It's staying in the passive house. So what is passive house? It's a performance-based building certification standard, and it focuses on the dramatic reduction of energy use, primarily for space heating and space cooling, but it addresses overall energy use as well. And the highlighted phrases there are probably the key ones to focus on. It's performance-based, so there's metrics to hit in terms of energy performance, and it's based on energy use. So it really narrows in on that section of the focus, where you may have things we're talking about here today, like LEED and living building challenges, kind of address a whole wide range of scopes, including energy. Passive house really zeroes in on the energy part of that. What you achieve by doing this is a reduction in overall energy use, of course, but you also see a reduction in the associated carbon emissions, which is really the reason we're doing this to begin with, is to reduce carbon emissions. But beyond those kind of big focuses, energy and carbon, we also see improvement in air quality, health of the building and occupant comfort inside of it. So lower instances of particulate matter and VOCs and other pollutants inside the building, better rates of ventilation, so air exchange. You also see kind of healthier living spaces, more comfortable and consistent room temperatures. So say the room temperatures are varying from room to room, or from say next to the window to next to the door. It's much more consistent. You don't have the air drafts coming in. It's not listed here, but you also have much quieter acoustic conditions. So you're keeping some of the sound from the street outside. You also have mechanical equipment that's usually a little quieter than typical equipment, so not producing as much noise. Some of these other benefits that kind of give a higher quality of life to the people that are in them, which is definitely important when we're looking at a lot of these large multifamily buildings, and especially the affordable housing buildings. We're really trying to talk about the benefits to the occupants of these places, and these are some big ones beyond the reduction in energy use. We also see lower operating costs, of course, and then a pathway to net zero, which I'll talk a little bit more about here in a moment. So what do I mean by energy reduction? What we achieve is a 90% or greater reduction in heating and cooling loads. And this isn't just a goal. Passive house is, as I mentioned, a performance standard, so you have to hit these numbers. So 90% or greater reduction compared to a typical building is what you can expect from passive house for space conditioning. In terms of overall energy use, it varies, but we definitely see a pretty consistently, maybe 60, 70% reduction in overall energy use from a typical project. A graph here, this is just kind of showing you a comparison of Massachusetts projects. So this is EUI, or a kBTUs per square foot of energy use in the building. And the left graph, or the left bar there, is showing you buildings built to the Massachusetts stretch code. And the one on the far right is showing you projects built to the FIAS plus 2015 standards, which is one of the more common passive house standards. You can ignore the middle one for now. But what you see is the variation. The stretch code buildings are, up there around 38 EUI down to maybe 28 at the low end, whereas the FIAS built projects are right there around 20 EUI. So a significant reduction from even stretch code buildings. If we were just looking at regular base code buildings, not the stretch code, it would be off this chart, maybe 55 or so. So it gives you an idea of the type of energy reduction that we're seeing in these projects. As I mentioned, they're also a pathway to net zero. So the passive house standard, sort of the core passive house standard, is not net zero. It doesn't require the project to be net zero. What it requires is that significant energy reduction. But because there is a significant energy reduction, many of these projects become net zero because they no longer require a large space for solar. They can now fit it on their roof. Or in the case of the Bullitt Center here in Seattle that you're seeing on kind of an extension of the roof. But that's one of the ways in which passive house is able to be this pathway to net zero by reducing energy demand significantly. Hopefully you can add renewables and get it on site, or maybe on site and a small off site somewhere else. How do passive house buildings actually achieve this? What are the features that's going into this? We're not going to go into all this today, but I just wanted to make sure that we all have our heads wrapped around what's different about passive house buildings. The main things are listed here. So you're seeing a continuous thermal insulation, so insulation wrapped kind of around the outside of the building, a reduction of thermal bridges, so place in the wall envelope where heat can transfer through an object. You also see an airtight envelope, so eliminating all the air gaps and air leaks in the building envelope. Using better performance windows and doors, of course, optimizing for solar heat gain. So actually using some of the sunlight in the winter months for by heat for the building, but then finding unique ways to block it out in the summer so you don't overheat the building. And then balanced ventilation and efficient mechanical systems. Passive house buildings do have mechanical systems. They still use heating and cooling being produced in the building, most commonly through say air source heat pumps or efficient VRF systems in multifamily buildings. And then pretty much every project has some type of energy recovery ventilator or heat recovery ventilator. For larger projects, these are sometimes one per unit, or sometimes are ducted to a group of units. That varies from project to project. What you're seeing on the right is Finch, Cambridge, that multifamily building, 98 unit in Cambridge. So on the top, you're seeing that blue fabric is a product from SIGA, and that's the air barrier system for this project. So it's just a thin membrane that was put onto the building. So it was put over the sheathing. So what they had on that building was just wood framed construction on the inside, dense packed that with either cellulose or fiberglass. I don't recall offhand, but dense packed it with that insulation, put sheathing on it, and then they put this air barrier system on top of that, and that's what you're seeing here. And you can also see the little white tape that they're using, showing you some of the detail that's important. From talking to folks who have worked on a lot of passive house projects in the area, probably the biggest difference from traditional projects is the level of detail. Just you have to be very, very consistent and very kind of particular about everything from taping the seams of your air barrier to how you install the windows to how the plumbing penetrations go through the envelope. All these little details become incredibly important. Down there on the bottom image, what you're seeing is how they attach the continuous thermal insulation to the outside of the building. So they used a mineral wool insulation material, but they attached it with these little plastic clips. That's the red part. So this not only provided a continuous level of insulation, but also reduced the thermal bridging from fasteners, because those plastic fasteners have a much lower thermal conductivity than, say, your typical metal fasteners you might use. So these are the type of details that become important with passive house projects and that really separate them from your traditional buildings. Now, in terms of certification, what does this actually mean? What are we actually measuring? So there's sort of two main categories: your performance criteria, and then sort of your other criteria, which sometimes are called the soft criteria. The performance criteria are the main ones. And this is focused on the areas of heating and cooling demand. So basically, how much energy is the building using for heating and how much energy is it using for cooling? Then there's whole building air tightness. So this is measured with a blower door test on site. So you're actually measuring the air tightness of the building. And I'll talk a little bit about that metric in a moment. And then the last one is your source energy demand. This is the overall energy use of the building itself, and it's measured in source energy. So for those of you familiar with, say, site energy and source energy, we're talking about source energy. So what actually has to be used at the power plant in terms of electricity. Some things you're not seeing here. You're not seeing the requirement for it to be net zero, like I mentioned before. You also don't have a requirement for it to be all electric. We do see passive house buildings that become all electric, but it's not a requirement of the standard. So in a lot of cases, some of these larger multifamily buildings might still have a gas line running in for water heating, for example. It's kind of a common use for that. But we're starting to see the shift to electric water heaters is a slower shift than it has been to, say, electric heating systems. There are two groups that sort of create the Passive House standard. There's the Passive House Institute, or PHI, and the Passive House Institute US, or FIAS. Both the organizations exist, and both organizations certify projects right here in Massachusetts and in the US. So don't let the names confuse you about Passive House Institute US versus non-US. They both exist and both certify projects. So they create and manage the Passive House standard. They define what the metrics are and what the criteria is and provide the certification. So when you enroll your project to become a Passive House, you pick one of these. You're not doing both. You're kind of enrolling with either PHI or with FIAS. And you're going through their certain standard and you're meeting their criteria. We're not going to go into the actual criteria today, the numbers. They're very similar between them, but there's just, little differences. So you enroll with the specific one, and you generally work with, say, a Passive House consultant or designer who's experienced with that specific program. In the case, both of them have sort of multiple pass certification. They have sort of their basic level Passive House certification. Then they do offer some kind of improvements above that. FIAS just rolled out their newest standards starting this year for 2021, which will, I think, become required after this year, so not till next year. But that includes their FIAS Core, which is what we've been talking about, the basic requirements to be a Passive House building. But they also introduced FIAS Zero, so a way to recognize projects that are becoming net zero. For the standards in Somerville and the other municipalities that are kind of putting Passive House into their zoning requirements, is simply that core metric, that simple base metric of becoming a Passive House building. So I mentioned the air tightness. I would come back to that. This is the one number I want to show because I think for most projects, especially the larger projects that we're seeing and the ones that would trigger the density bonuses and things in Somerville, air tightness becomes the most critical metric rather than, say, the thermal performance and the heating performance. Most projects through the design phase are really able to hit that through tweaking how they design the project. But the on-site construction is really where the air tightness is tested, and that's where it becomes important. All those details, making sure everything gets right on the construction of the project, really determines if this is hit or not. So 0.6 air changes per hour at 50 pascals of pressure. That's just a fancy way of talking about how the amount of air, the level of air tightness the project has to achieve. The current energy code in Massachusetts says 3, so you can kind of see it's a pretty steep reduction, and why this is probably the big metric projects are focused on. But by doing project, proper detailing on site, making sure you have the quality assurance and the quality control there allows you to make sure that's successful. So I want to talk a little bit about how Passive House fits into, say, LEED, and I can mention the Living Building Challenge here as well. But with LEED, as you know, it's kind of a whole bunch of other, a whole bunch of wide range of categories where you can get points. But Passive House really helps you narrow in on a couple of those. So obviously energy and atmosphere, which is a big part of LEED credits. Passive House really allows you to hit quite a few of those. But it also can allow you to hit some of the indoor environmental quality credits as well, because of that focus on ventilation, fresh air. You see some of those points being hit as well. So Passive House is really complementary to projects that are, so if you're already familiar with, getting a LEED Platinum building, when you look at those energy and atmosphere credits, for example, you're going to see Passive House really beat a lot of those. The other big thing with Passive House, and where I think it's really important, and I like the question that was brought up earlier about, is certification, where it doesn't just have to be certifiable. Certification is really important, and it does have to be done. And that's because what Passive House does is it provides that third-party certification. This isn't just you as a designer, or a developer, or a builder kind of vouching for your project. This is actually a third party who's coming in verifying that you have done this, that you have done the right energy modeling, that you built the project how you were supposed to build it. You're testing it on site through these blow door tests and other means, really making sure that you hit the level of performance and quality that Passive House requires. So some sort of examples. I really only have one to talk about. I mean, Somerville is why we're here today, but we've seen this happen in other places as well in different ways. What we have in terms of the policy front is Passive House is really being addressed sort of in a scattershot way. You're seeing different municipalities across the country, and honestly around the world as well. A lot of cities in Europe have kind of led the way. You're seeing them incorporate this in different ways. But like Somerville, they're trying to figure out how to address their own carbon emissions. And just like that graph that Oliver showed, where they noticed that, in Somerville, buildings were a huge source of carbon emissions. Other cities are noticing the same thing and turning to passive house as a method to address that. So Vancouver was one of the first larger scale cities to do this, and they set aside zoning requirements that included specific low emission targets. And they outlined both passive house and ILFI, the Living Future Institute, as a way to actually to meet that. This plan, the zero emissions plan, actually requires that all buildings are meeting this, all new buildings by 2030, and they have some requirements for some buildings by 2025. And they also offer space bonuses here for affordable projects. One of the unique things they did, and what I would like to see other cities who do types of zoning requirements like this or other passive house initiatives, is that they train some sitting building inspectors. So the folks actually going out inspecting these projects were trained in this case as certified passive house trade persons, which is one of the certifications offered through PHI or FIAS. And this is really, I think, essential so that everyone's really speaking the same language, and so that they're able to really inspect these details on site. These are two projects here. Both of them are fairly large units that are passive house. The one on the top, I believe, is the all affordable one. So we're seeing sort of a mix of affordable units and market rate units that are doing this. Here in Massachusetts, we have a lot of progress on policy. Somerville, of course, at the municipal level. At the state level, the ongoing debate around the net zero code is, passive house is wrapped up in that, and we'll see what comes out of that. But a lot of municipalities are addressing this, so Somerville is not alone. Cambridge is addressing in various ways. We've also seen Newton incorporate passive house into their own sort of zoning ordinance. For certain large projects that trigger their special permitting process, they do have passive house or living building as a requirement there. Excuse me. The other ways is with affordable housing. So the DHCD here has now included passive house as a way to sort of incentivize projects to achieve passive house in order to get affordable housing funds. They do this through their exemplary energy performance category, where passive house projects get 5 bonus points. So if you are a project who's applying for funding and you are proposing that your project will be a passive house building, you get those extra points, and it goes a long way to achieving those funds. This is something where Pennsylvania was actually the first state to incentivize passive house in this way. It was very, very successful in doing it. They saw in the first couple of years, 20 to 30 different projects going through achieving funds. And what they saw is that the cost comparison was that those passive house projects were on par with the non-passive house projects that were approved. So incredible performance. We're really hoping that Massachusetts sort of echoes this here. The other source of sort of incentives that we've seen in Massachusetts is through the Mass Save program. So they've, for the last couple of years now, have been incentivizing mid-rise and high-rise projects. So basically any residential project of 5 units or more can receive funding through them. So these are, you can see it here on the screen. I can answer more questions about it, but basically they're giving you per unit funds. So when you are certified, it's up to $3,000 per unit, split between pre-certification and certification. So some of that money you get upfront when it's pre-certified. You don't have to wait till the end. They also cover energy modeling. And what we're really excited about and what we've seen a lot of projects enroll in are the feasibility studies. This is for projects who you're not quite sure you want to go passive house, but you can have a feasibility study done to see what it would be like for your project, everything from the cost to the time on site, like what does this mean for you and how feasible is it? And they're covering up to 100% of those costs. So really great, and we're encouraging as many projects as possible to go through this. So that's the end of my presentation. As I said, I didn't have a lot of details. What I'm going to rely on are questions from you guys for me to keep talking. So I don't have the chat room on, so I'm actually going to turn it on now and see what folks are asking.
Great. Thanks a ton, Aaron. Fantastic. And I agree and encourage everyone to go through the feasibility study. And I encourage you to even think about doing that for zero carbon as well, because it's something that people just don't understand and how useful it could be to you. The questions are pretty technical. I think they're sort of been taken care of. Evan asked a couple things about those plastic fasteners.
Yes, those were Cascadia, and it's already been mentioned that there are other manufacturers with similar clips.
Right. So I'm gonna go ahead and let us move forward and hear from Jacob, and then we can open up a much wider conversation. I think there's I have a bunch of questions, and I think there's probably a bunch of them. So Jacob, it's all yours.
Oh, hi, everybody. My name is Jacob Bloom. I'm an associate at Cambridge 7, which is an architecture and design firm in Cambridge. I'm here to talk about the Zero Carbon certification today from the International Living Future Institute. It's one of ILFI's newer certifications, which is probably why we haven't seen a ton of case studies on it show up in Somerville yet, but I think it's a really exciting certification that's much more attainable than some of the other ILFI certifications that are more aspirational, still great certifications, but harder to achieve. For those of you that are less familiar with the International Living Future Institute, their mission is to catalyze a transformation towards communities that are socially just, culturally rich, and ecologically restorative. That all sounds fantastic. You know, what does that really mean? So they boiled it down to this question of what does good look like? If we stop setting our reference plane as how can we do 50% better or 70% better or 90% better? What would it mean to stop doing better and actually have a positive impact? And what does that mean for buildings and other things as well? And so from that question, they came out with 9 programs currently. Their flagship program is the Living Building Challenge, which is really looking at sort of a holistic picture of what does it look like to have a positive impact for a building. They also have 2 other living challenges, the Living Product Challenge and Living Community Challenge, that are asking those same questions as well. Then they have 3 green building certifications, Zero Energy, Zero Carbon, that we're here to talk about today, and Core Green Building, which is a little bit more holistic as well, but not as aggressive as the Living Building Challenge goals. And then they also have 3 transparency labels, which are basically like nutrition labels, but for building products or companies and organizations or buildings themselves. And so thinking about what does it mean for a building to actually be good, how can we examine how we're building, what we're building to have a positive impact? And from an energy standpoint and a greenhouse gas emission standpoint, we know that buildings globally make up about 40% of greenhouse gas emissions. And about 30% of that is from operational energy, right? The electricity that's coming from the electrical plant, as well as on-site burning of fossil fuels. But there's another 10% that's coming from the energy used to make the building products, right? To make the steel, to make the concrete, to erect the building. And that's a growing percentage of global emissions. And so to put that in context, this slide says by 2060, the last I heard it was actually by 2040, it's expected that we're going to be building the entire square footage of New York City every 34 days. And when you think about the amount of energy that goes into making all of those materials, that's huge. Over the next 2 decades, it's expected that about 50% of greenhouse gas emissions from new construction is going to be in the form of that embodied carbon from building products and construction, and only 50% is going to be from operational energy. And so the Zero Carbon certification looks at both of these things and tries to tackle both of them. And that's, I think, what really sets it apart from some of the other certifications that are out there right now. And so on the one hand, we've got the operational energy that's coming from your electrical plants. And then you've also got the embodied carbon, the carbon that greenhouse gas emissions that come from the making of building products, transporting them to the site, erecting them. And so we'll talk about each of those and how the Zero Carbon certification addresses them. Essentially, the goal of the certification is first to reduce each of those and then to offset the rest. And so to first look at operational carbon, the first step is to eliminate all on-site combustion. And there are exceptions to this. So if anyone out there is thinking they can't do this certification because they've got a situation where they need combustion for something, there are exceptions that I'll talk about a little bit later. But as a whole, we want to eliminate all natural gas and burning of fossil fuels or any fuels on site. And then we need to reduce our EUI for the building by 25% below the ASHRAE 2010 baseline. So for those of you that are energy modelers out there, 25% below ASHRAE 2010 is a little bit more strict than the current Massachusetts stretch code, but it's definitely attainable. Once you've reduced that minimum of 25%, everything else you need to offset through the construction of new renewable sources such as solar or wind. Those can be on site, on rooftops. They also recognize that for a lot of the buildings that we're talking about building, especially in Somerville, these are very tall buildings. They have very little rooftop compared to the square footage of the building, and that you may not be able to fit all of the renewable resources you need on site. And so they allow for off-site renewables as well. But they do need to be new construction renewables. You can't purchase RECs. You can't do anything that essentially is already being accounted for another project. So that means that if a developer is building a project and they don't have room to put all their renewables on site, they could look to their other projects in the area and potentially add solar to those projects and attribute it to this new construction project, or they could reach out to other options as well, right? They could go to the Winter Hill School down the street in Somerville and see if they could put solar panels across the entire roof of the Winter Hill School to help offset the greenhouse gas emissions from this new building. The other side of this is the embodied carbon. And this is one that until pretty recently has been harder to sort of wrap our heads around because we didn't have good numbers for it. But more and more, we're seeing more environmental product declarations that are declaring how much embodied carbon is coming from these building products that are going into the building. And so the first step in the embodied carbon certification side of it is to do an analysis, a life cycle analysis for what the embodied carbon of the building is. And then includes all major components of the building, all structure, envelope, foundations, interior finishes, that sort of thing. It doesn't account for any furniture or anything like that. Once you have that baseline, you have to find a way to reduce it by a minimum of 10%. And then at the end of construction, whatever's left beyond that 10%, you would purchase in the form of carbon offsets to get you down to a net zero carbon emissions. And that's really the big picture of the whole certification, right? First, for operational energy, you reduce by at least 25%, hopefully more than that, but at least 25%. And then you put in renewables to offset the rest. And then for embodied carbon, you run the analysis to see what your embodied carbon is. You reduce by a minimum of 10%, and then you purchase carbon offsets to offset the rest. And so, you know, every development, the question is, you know, what is the value of doing this? Why would we do this? And obviously here today, we're talking about Somerville, and a great reason to do this is the zoning incentives that Oliver laid out. But there are other values as well. So similar to Passive House, this is a performance-based certification. So after construction, once the building is occupied for 12 months, ILFI will review the energy use of the building and ensure that the energy being generated from the renewables is offsetting 100% of the energy use of the building. Another one is for industry recognition, and this is one that's really becoming a pretty big deal. And we're seeing a lot of major companies that are doing this really to market their brand and their reputation, right? We're seeing companies like Microsoft and Google and Salesforce who have said that they're going to meet these targets, and I'll come back to that in a minute. And then there's the financial side of things, and this is the bullet center that Aaron showed as well. It is a fully living certified building, but they recognize that when you're building a building, there's a lot of financial analysis involved, and it's got to make financial sense. And this is something that really can, and the numbers are there to prove it. And Salesforce has said that they're going to have all of their office fit outs zero carbon certified by 2030. We've also seen this from Google, and Microsoft has gone past this and said that by 2050, they're going to have offset their entire historical carbon footprint. And while I'm sure all these companies are doing it because they have good morals and it's the right thing to do. It's also very much a business move that this is building their brand, and this is what consumers are starting to look for. So to look at a couple case studies for zero carbon certification and what this looks like. This is Google's new offices in London. It is a zero carbon certified building. And this really shows that, scale is no limit for this certification. A lot of times when we talk about net zero and then we start to talk about high rises or really large buildings, people get afraid of how they're going to hit net zero. And the zero carbon certification really does that by allowing you to offset with renewables offsite. Another project is Te Kura Whare of the Tuhoi people on the South Island of Aotearoa, currently known as New Zealand. So this goes beyond the zero carbon certification. This is another fully living certified building by the Living Building Challenge. So in addition to collecting 105% of their energy on site, they're also collecting and processing all of their water on site. They're using all non-toxic materials, and they're addressing things like health, equity, site context, beauty as part of the Living Building Challenge. So just to touch on a few of the common exceptions for the zero carbon certification, from a natural gas standpoint or an on-site combustion standpoint, there's an exception for commercial kitchens. It is not just a blanket exception. Anyone seeking this exception needs to document why there is not an electric alternative to what they're trying to do. But if a developer can come forward and show that they're building a commercial kitchen and that there is not a feasible electric alternative for a certain cooking process, they could get an exception to still allow combustion for that process. There's a similar exception, I don't have a slide for it, but for lab buildings, and while Somerville has other requirements for lab buildings, for things like Bunsen burners and lab experiments that require really high source of heat at a specific point, there's exceptions for that as well. And then there's an exception for pre-existing infrastructure. And this would be if solar panels were already installed, say on a campus, on another building, and you built them basically in advance of the project that you're attributing them to. You can still get credit for them as long as you can document that they were put on whatever other location specifically for this forthcoming building. There are also some exceptions for existing natural gas in existing buildings, but that's another conversation. The registration process is pretty straightforward. First, you become a member, you register the project, you upload your documentation, and then after 12 months post-occupancy, ILFI will do the audit. ILFI also offers a series of other resources, handbooks, ambassadors like myself, as well as technical service consultants. And that's it. So, I hope that this has been sort of a good overview of the program. It's a pretty simple program, but it's really got aggressive goals, but in a very flexible way that allows it to be extremely attainable for a variety of projects. And it's really a first step towards a clean energy future. And now hopefully you're ready to get started on your next zero carbon certification.
Right on. Thank you, Jacob. So this, what we've just done is looked at sort of the two newer, kind of more aggressive parts of this Somerville zoning pathways to, to reaching lower carbon, higher performance buildings. These are pretty interesting. Probably a little bit more experience out there, certainly with us. We're just beginning to do our first zero carbon certification work, but there's a little more experience with the passive house. But there are definitely issues around how to do it, what it does for you, how it works for the city. And I think I'd really love to hear a little bit from folks in the audience about sort of how you see the difference between really going after carbon through something like the zero carbon certification and more sort of in a more focused way going after energy use and sort of very serious energy use reduction and sort of by relationship carbon reduction. And that Passive House is really what Passive House is about. I find them both very interesting, and I'm really interested in what others have to say about their experience trying to do that. And Oliver, maybe you can start a little bit about sort of how you kind of got to those choices. What did that process look like?
Yeah, well, I don't have too much more to say than what I said in my presentation, but I can add a little bit more, which is we did start, like every city, seeing what have others done, right? And so some of the examples that were mentioned in the last presentations of other cities were definitely inspiration. But I will just say again, I mean, what we were looking for, which I think is evident in the definition, is we weren't looking for like a net zero energy building, because we just don't have the urban form that makes that realistic. And what we definitely are interested in is in eliminating fossil fuel combustion and extremely efficient, buildings through, envelope and things like that. So we had to kind of juggle the different pieces that we wanted, and realizing that there's no one perfect standard, nor is there anything that we could, as I mentioned in my presentation, we can't just say like, well, maybe Brookline would differ, but we can't just say like, no natural gas as of today. We were really looking for third-party standards that got close to fossil fuel-free, high-performing buildings, and that's where we landed. And then I'll just repeat what I said in my presentation, which is we realized that we have a bit of a role in bringing the awareness and popularity of new standards in by specifically making them pathways. So we, no offense to USGBC, but we wanted to see standards other than LEED, because we actually thought they got it closer to where we were going. So that's a bit of the thinking that I don't think will surprise anyone on this call, but that's where this came from.
That's a great answer. Thanks, Oliver. Much appreciated. Any other sort of thoughts from the audience about sort of the different pathways and what your experience is with them, or what your experience would like to be with them? And if nobody pipes up, I'm going to ask questions, and they're going to be tough.
Well, Jim, I have just a quick reaction, which is that not really directly answering your question, but it does occur to me that, and perhaps stating the obvious, that the standard that's more focused on carbon writ broad obviously can potentially have really interesting feedback loops on the supply chain, but we're such a small market that, of course, that impact is de minimis. But it doesn't mean that that we shouldn't lead in that space.
I think that's a great comment, Galen. You need to mute yourself while I talk. Very good. Hopefully today, with some of our friends from the great state of Maine, we can spread that view a little wider than just Massachusetts. But I'd also be very interested in that thought. I mean, you make a really good point that Passive House is a really achievable, doable process. And one of the reasons it's gotten so much traction is through the incentives that Mass CEC have provided. It's been very, very effective. which is fantastic. Is there a logic to say, well, maybe we want to think about that in some more carbon focused way as well?
We would welcome that discussion. Always want to hear stakeholder input.
I believe we have a room full of stakeholders. Here we go. Other thoughts? I know that that both Passive House and Zero Carbon as a pair are gaining a lot of traction around the country. And I think that's really quite exciting. Go ahead, Jim.
I didn't talk about that specifically, but obviously Passive House has really great reductions in energy use, which reduces the amount of solar you would need to get down to net zero carbon as well. So they definitely pair well together. I think, whether or not you're certifying Passive House for zero carbon, a lot of the things that Aaron talked about of ways of reducing energy are still applicable to all buildings, regardless of certification.
Well, so Jim, maybe I can ask your question in a more pointed and self-serving way, but okay, so there's design and permitting consultants on this call. When you're working on projects in Somerville, are your development clients and partners putting the decision in your hands of how to comply? Like how early on in the process does that happen? Or if it's not in your hands, how are you being pushed or explained to go in one direction or the other, or another potential way? Are there just administrative and compliance questions with some of the different pathways that would be useful, that are instructive and in the decisions that you make?
Hi, this is Allison. I can provide a little insight maybe. So I'm working on, I'm a sustainability consultant with a green engineer, and we're working on I am particularly working on a couple projects in Somerville, but they're lab office buildings. So certain pathways are easy or make more sense than others. A couple of folks from one of the projects are on the call with me actually on this webinar. So we are pursuing LEED Platinum because it's a lab building, and for a lab building that makes the most sense as far as, or at least to start with. I think my general comment would be two things are helpful. I mean, all the guidance from Somerville is helpful, and then also the Massachusetts, the building code envelope backstop is making, I think, Passive House more palatable to people because we're already having to reduce the window to wall ratio, and we're doing things just to meet the code now. I think on a lab building, obviously the fossil fuel use is an issue, which is why you've made the exception for LEED Platinum. I think also LEED is just more familiar to people. So Passive House definitely is a little more palatable on a residential scale, as if we're looking at comparing that to a tall office lab building. ILFI, we've definitely looked at for this project. I think some of the, I think it's not as clear I guess the advice to Somerville is if there was an example of what you're looking for in a project that went through it, that would be easier, but obviously you've just started. I think some of the performance, following through with the certifications with the performance requirements after the building's built is challenging, especially to a developer. So those are just sort of random thoughts. I'm definitely in support of all of these things. We definitely start early. All the teams are starting early on all of these. I mean, very early in the project, we're looking at everything. So I think what you've presented to everyone with the new zoning is definitely getting everyone's attention, and we're starting much earlier with clients. People are definitely more interested earlier. So that was sort of a random bunch of comments. I don't know if anything jumped out to you or if you have any feedback on any of those.
No, that's interesting. I mean, the familiarity option, the explanation is not a surprise, but does make a lot of sense to me. Yeah, that's helpful.
Hi, this is Sarah with the Green Engineer. I'm going to add on to what Allison said, and because I too am working on some lab office buildings in Somerville. And I agree with everything that she said, but really, honestly, the only way to really achieve these high levels of sustainability and energy efficiency is to engage super early on with the team. Everyone needs to commit and really just move forward collectively and together, making decisions together. And so I would say that maybe some of the things that you guys have instituted with zoning is really reinforcing the need to start early and stick with it and see it through. That's a positive thing.
I got to say, this is something to hand to Mass CEC. The incentive for feasibility studies has been fantastic. That has transformed our experience working with development teams, and I think it's probably changed their experience quite a bit as well. It's really valuable to get people in thinking about this stuff right off the bat in schematic design. Just awesome, and I really recommend doing the same thing for zero carbon. We just essentially do a single feasibility study that looks at a couple of these things, does some modeling, boom, boom. I think it's great. Aaron, you're going to say something?
Yeah, well, I was just echoing what you're saying right now. In the chat room, there were some comments that, we were talking a little bit about the cost premium, and I mentioned how one way people have brought it down in other places just through experience. Having more GCs, more subs who are experienced with these projects lead to smaller cost increases. But the other big one is what you were just talking about: getting started early, having an integrated approach to these projects makes a huge difference in the successfulness of the team, the ability to not just be pre-certified, but actually be certified at the end, and to hit your targets and to bring the costs down is getting everyone on board. That just, not just the GC or the designer, but having the mechanical engineer involved early on, who can be involved in the designing the heating and cooling and ventilation system from the beginning. These are the type of things you need to, this early start is critical. That's all I was going to add.
I think too, like having a format that, like the resiliency checklist, the I can't remember what it's, Sustainaville, can't remember what the exact name is, but the resiliency checklist is helpful because the clients know they have to submit that. So if there's anything else that the city wants, if you can be clear about that, the team members can make sure the city gets that information. It depends on the team how much information they're willing to share with the city without it being requested. So the things like the checklist are helpful because we can say we need to submit this, and you have to do certain analysis to get that information. So I think from the city's standpoint, if there are things you want that you're not seeing and you can let the teams know, we can help it. The whole team can help push that along. But on our own, it just depends on each individual team, what they want to share with the city at what point, if it's not laid out clearly. Which you probably know that, but we always find it helpful when there's examples of what the city wants to see.
Right. Okay, great.
Maybe you can talk briefly about the tool you showed a little bit of and sort of where that falls within the process. Yeah.
So just for total transparency, the way we do things here is that the planning team, which is who most of you would interact with, manage all of the process, and they pull in departments like mine to review narrow parts of it at certain points. So I am not the ultimate authority on all steps of permitting and zoning administration. But what I will say is that we developed this tool essentially to simplify and get better information from on energy performance than what was in the questionnaire that folks had been filling in for the last maybe 3 years. And The tool can be used at a few different points. So first of all, I'll clarify that this is for projects that require site plan approval. So it's only a certain size, and you can provide basic input about energy systems, and if you're effectively building an all-electric building already, you probably will just, unless it's wildly inefficient, which I don't think would happen, you basically just, it's over. And then if there is some fossil fuel in the building, which I think is what we're going to see a lot of in LEED Platinum labs, then there's a, so that's information you provide, like sort of pre-submittal to the planning board. And then afterward, there's, more information about comparing different systems to, and tracking overall performance in different categories to a low load building and a code building. And that again is really just to elucidate where some of the design changes might be made, or where we can help the applicants and the planning board understand why a building might be exceeding or not falling below what we're thinking of as a low load building. So I described it in pretty general terms, and I know there was a question earlier to take a look at it, and I'm happy to share that. I don't know if there's anyone on the call working on any projects that have already received it, but if there are, I would be curious to know what you think. Otherwise, we'll be working together in the future probably.
I think this is Sarah again. I think if there's a tool like that Somerville's piloting or intending to use, it would be helpful for the project teams to be proactive and have an opportunity to work with it rather than do a lot of work on their design and come up with some proposed pathways and then be requested to work with this tool. If there's a way to integrate it earlier with the project team, I think there'd be more benefit overall for everybody.
All right, so there's something about coming at it right away.
Right.
Are there other thoughts about this or other questions for Jacob and Aaron about certifications? We've got about 7 minutes, so now's your chance. Experience from a developer perspective around making decisions about, we're going to do this, we're not going to do it, too crazy, this is really valuable. How do those decisions go? Things like that. Michael, you're still muted. I'm not quite sure why. Yeah.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, there we go.
Jacob, I was curious with the zero carbon project, what are the tools for auditing your project during design on a carbon standpoint, and if there's tools for energy and understanding where you're sourcing the materials and what are the carbon costs of getting those materials to your sites?
Yeah, so ILFI has a list of approved LCA tools. It's pretty standard list and includes things like Tally and Athena and EC3. So any of those tools are acceptable to them. I believe the scope is A1 through A4. So there is, in those tools, there would be accounting for transportation to the site. Unlike the Living Building Challenge or CORE, there's no requirement for where they're sourced from. So there's no within 500 kilometers for 20% of your building materials or anything like that. It just has to be accounted for. And generally, it sounds, from what I've heard, transportation embodied carbon is probably like 8%, maybe 10% of your embodied carbon for any one material. So, and that would be in your baseline as well. So as far as where things are sourced from, that I don't think that would be a limitation for this. And any of the standard tools ILFI would accept pretty much.
Thank you.
Sure enough. The real trick there is that the zero carbon certification requires a 10% reduction in embodied carbon from a baseline. And so there are a couple of different ways you can get baselines, which luckily are becoming more achievable. But you want to be, that's the same kind of thing. This is why that feasibility study process, I think, is valuable. You want to be thinking about that reduction from a baseline pretty right up front, because it's not necessarily a slam dunk to get it.
I think that, yeah. So I think that as far as that 10% reduction from baseline, 10% is not huge. It's certainly something that you need to be thinking about. I think it's not something that you can ignore through all of design and then get to construction and assume that you're just going to choose the, lower embodied carbon materials for what you've already specified. That probably won't work. But I think as long as you're addressing it from the beginning, it's totally attainable. I mean, 50% of your embodied carbon's from your structure. So if you just have the conversation with your structural engineer up front, have them run a couple analyses for different systems and look at what the embodied carbon of, say, 2 or 3 different structural systems would be, you've already got a pretty good starting point for that reduction. And I would also say that, to your point about baselines, we still don't have great baselines, but the Carbon Leadership Forum baselines currently are fairly conservative, I would say, as a starting point. And that's sort of been the point of them, is to set a conservative baseline so that then we can work on improving it. And as we get more data, those baselines will become more firm. But I think right now the baseline is pretty comfortable, especially here where you can do better than your steel embodied carbon baseline by just sourcing domestic steel instead of imported steel, or concrete by increasing your amount of substitution cementitious material, et cetera. So there are a lot of tools, even without changing the design side of things, if you just think about it.
Got time for one more.
Jim, this is Galen again. Not so much a question, but maybe a quick comment that would allow for another question, which is just to say quickly that.
So, dude, are we starting at Turner Edge or right to the vote?
Okay. Hold on. Hey, Jerry, you need to mute. Thanks.
That with regard to embodied carbon, I'm completely bought in. I'm glad that so many people are focused on it. It's harder for us, and it's harder for the state to dedicate resources to it because it's not part of our carbon accounting by and large. And that's kind of which I'm sure that Oliver and others who are in the public sector are aware of, and perhaps all of you. But so it's not a reason for us not to do anything. It's just a harder argument for us to make internally that it should be prioritized, which is why I think the law you cited, Jim, in California, the link I circulated for New York, why those are interesting, because I think once we begin to see leadership at the state level on accounting for the carbon content of materials, then it will be easier for state entities and quasis to allocate resources in that regard. But to date, we haven't done that. Of course, it's everyone's responsibility to push for that. But that's one of our challenges. So just noting that.
It's great. It's a great thing to say, Galen. Hey, Jerry. All right. Last things you want to say, Aaron, Jacob?
This has been great. Thanks for putting on the session. I'll just, on the topic of embodied carbon, because that is certainly where my mind has been lately as well, along with everyone, I imagine. Well, Passive House Standard doesn't incorporate onto the PS or PHI. They are thinking about it in ways. So I should mention that the On the PHI side of things, the Passive House Planning Package, which is PHPP, is one of the modeling tools you can use to do your energy modeling. It does now include an add-on that has embodied carbon. So it doesn't do anything to you meeting the standard, but it does at least give you an idea when you're running your energy model of your design of what the embodied carbon of the project is. It's mostly right now based on European data, and I think most of the UK data, so it's not exactly relevant for our project here, but we'll give you at least an idea of are you able to, have a shifting some of the materials you're using, does that have an impact on embodied carbon without having to run a separate model?
Awesome. Yeah, that's a great thing to see. Jacob, any sort of final comments?
I mean, I think it's been a great presentation. Thank you to Oliver and Aaron for talking about what you spoke about. It's been a great discussion as well. I think that the zero carbon certification is really, it's one of the first ones out there to really pay attention to the embodied carbon side of things. And I think that that's something that we're going to have to start paying more and more attention to as our operational carbon starts to come down. Our embodied carbon is what's left, and it's still a pretty dramatic chunk of our emissions. So I think it's a great way to start paying attention to it.
Yeah, and I'm psyched that there are municipalities out there really beginning to look at this, which is fantastic. I'd like to note that there's a feedback survey in the chat. Please fill it out, and then I'll land on Oliver. Any final things you want to say?
Thank you for putting this together and for focusing on Somerville. Of course, I think everything we do is amazing and unique, but really,
couldn't agree more.
It's really interesting to hear the feedback, and I hope I'll just reiterate the message that we are really interested always in pushing the boundary, and we really like hearing feedback, even if sometimes it's criticism, but on how we can work together to keep doing that. So thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Oliver. And I think we can all agree that Somerville is doing a pretty awesome job right now. It's really impressive. Great team. Meredith, anything you want to land on last?
Yeah, I want to say that there's a pretty active group for Carbon Leadership Forum in Massachusetts. We partner with them often. They're doing, we're doing some great work along with them and others with the City of Boston. And so look for some updates from the city of recommendations that then, Galen, your point, I just heard that loud and clear, and sounds like there's some advocacy work to be done at the state level related to embodied carbon. So, but a lot of people, there's been a lot of action, and it's really exciting to have Passive House Mass here, to have Jacob and the Living Collaborative, and Jim and all. Thank you to Jim and Diane as our leaders, and it's so great to have all of you. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thanks a lot, everybody. We're a couple minutes over. Talk to you later.
Thank you very much. Thank you.